Well, over the years, many have said Dark Souls 1 is split into two halves. The claim is that there's a noticeable dip in quality from the first half to the second, and the game arguably peaks in the middle around Ornstein and Smough. Hidetaka Miyazaki is the famous creative director, designer, writer, and president, and in the 2012 DesignWorks interview conducted by Famitsu, he was asked which boss gave him the most trouble. As he pauses to think about this, a Dark Souls concept artist, Hiroshi Nakamura, jumps in and jokes that all of them cause trouble. Miyazaki agrees with this and reveals that deadlines were closing in and he couldn't quite achieve the vision he had in mind, so they were forced to settle. The primary example of this frustration is given as the Bed of Chaos. He then goes on to say outright that the Bed of Chaos is his greatest regret. Izalith was clearly one of the key areas hit by the game's reduced development cycle, and one clear example of this is the Bounding Demons. They are lower halves of undead dragons, known affectionately within the community as Dragon Butts, most likely intended to be a mini-boss, but rushed development led them to recycle it here, with 29 of them spread out in this single area. It's possible they intended to pair it with the top half of this crawling undead dragon, but unfortunately we'll never really know. A lot of these areas are larger and mostly empty. Sometimes they're filled with a multitude of the same enemy types, and this broad stroke placement style is much more common in Izalith than anywhere else. The vast amount of cut content that's been unearthed in this area also proves how a lot of their ideas ended up unrealized. There's inaccessible tunnels behind unbreakable illusory walls that never ended up being used for anything. There are uniquely grotesque enemies that never saw the light of day. Although maybe that was a good thing in this case. Izalith was originally a swamp, which we can see in the original concept art. It makes more sense as to why certain enemies, and especially cut enemies, were included here, and even explains the general environment. It's more natural for all the giant twisting tree branches to be in a place like this. All the bosses of this area are relatively weak. That being said, Bed of Chaos is easily the most controversial of the lot. It's a puzzle boss, but an unusually frustrating one that ultimately becomes a battle against gravity. The actual boss is a tiny chaos bug hidden in the center, but to reach it you have to get past the tree guardian above as the arena crumbles around you, and every attempt requires 2 to 3 minutes minimum of running back. A different version of this boss was uncovered in the game files, which shows movement abilities, which is more evidence of an attempted revision that was cut short and abandoned. It was ultimately a vision that needed more time. I want to share a quote from the CEO of Moon Studios, Thomas Mailer, and it's because he mentions Dark Souls 1, and it's quite interesting. As games become more and more complex and sophisticated, we'll see some form of early access happening more and more often. Imagine Dark Souls 1 would have been in early access. Instead of From Software rushing to ship a boxed product in a somewhat unfinished state, they probably would have been able to look at the second half of that game and still fully form and polish the less polished areas like Lost Izalith. If Dark Souls had been initially released in an early alpha state where the community could give feedback, test new features, and fund further development, would the game have been better? I'm guessing a lot of people would be in favor of more extensive network testing. Early access would provide a larger pool of players to test online features, which has long been an issue in the Dark Souls series from the first game onwards. If early access has so many benefits, why outside of indie developers is it so rarely used? Well, from a logical perspective, if you buy into an early access game, you are definitively experiencing the worst version of that game that will ever exist. It's highly likely this alpha or beta build will have subpar performance, and the consumer ultimately has no guarantee that the game they're playing will ever see a full release. There's even been instances where an early access game receives negative feedback, harming its reputation forever, even when the eventual final product is significantly improved. But let's get specific to Dark Souls. Would the early access model even be compatible with FromSoft's approach to game development? A reason why it might not work here is the unique way in which FromSoft tells stories. The story in Dark Souls is told through elegant world building and narrative design. We take this subtle storytelling style for granted these days, but back in 2009 and 2011, this was not the norm. Storytelling was done through dialogue, cutscenes, and text dumps.
I hate books.
While in contrast, almost every aspect in Dark Souls serves the wider story and lore, from item descriptions and ambiguous NPC dialogue to environmental and character design. The whole world paints a picture, and only choosing to reveal parts of it would hamstring the story. Early access could lead to major story elements being spoiled before the full release. FromSoft are notoriously secretive. Generally, you won't know anything about their projects until they choose to release it via standard marketing and trailers. Something else commonly attributed to early access games as a positive is that the players become the play testers. The players help the developers identify problems and suggest improvements that they may miss. However, you can also just continue to patch and hotfix the game after release, which is something FromSoft have actively done after every title. And AAA studios routinely hire entire teams of playtesters under NDA with the sole purpose of hunting down every single bug, glitch, or soft lock they can find. But let's say Dark Souls did release as an early access title. Currently, on the Steam store page, there are over 8,000 early access titles, all competing for the same pool of players willing to risk buying an unfinished product. And that makes it hard for a niche title to stand out. Maybe it's hard for us to imagine Dark Souls being a niche title, but that's because we've forgotten its origins. Dark Souls was frequently compared to its predecessor, Demon Souls, which was itself a very niche title. In case you forgot, in an interview with Game Informer, Sony Worldwide Studios president Shuhei Yoshida famously said, "When it was close to final, I spent close to 2 hours playing it. And after 2 hours, I was still standing at the beginning of the game. I said, this is crap. This is an unbelievably bad game. So I put it aside." Sony executives believed that Demon Souls was too difficult and niche to appeal to Western audiences. Its punishing difficulty and obscure design were thought to limit its potential success outside Japan, so much so that Sony refused to publish it in the Western markets. Shuhei Yoshida ended up admitting in interviews that this decision was regrettable, and they underestimated the game's potential appeal. When it comes to early access, it cannot be overstated that managing player expectations and balancing feedback is a monumental task. And if Dark Souls had been an early access title, who's to say players wouldn't have heavily criticized its difficulty and been frustrated with the obscure mechanics? There's a very high chance that the core vision of the game would have been changed to appease players at the time. How great would the temptation have been to compromise for a wider audience? Of course, there is one more factor in all this. During the development of Dark Souls, the company was far smaller than today. Looking at the team size at the time Dark Souls was being released, we can estimate their size to be 80 to 100 internal developer staff based on the official credits and not including outsourced workers and contributors. Over a decade later, according to the official FromSoft company page, they have grown to 397 employees as of June 2023. But that's not too surprising when you look at how much their games have grown in size and complexity, culminating in the titan that is Elden Ring. When concluding the DesignWorks interview, Miyazaki and his team agreed that they learned a lot while working on Dark Souls, and that it turned out fine in the end. Which, considering how influential it was on the industry, is a very humble statement. Certainly, Dark Souls has its flaws, yet it's still cited as one of the greatest video games of all time. With its unique design and philosophy, it's frequently brought up in discussions on video games as an art form. It's one of the most influential video games of its generation. This is why I think Dark Souls was not an early access game. First, it had already secured funding, so they didn't need to raise more investment. Demon Souls had proved the formula could work, which meant at this point a full release was expected to be polished and complete, like the first. And releasing Dark Souls as an early access game could have damaged the reputation they were building as a studio. They had a publisher, and by opting for a traditional release, From Software and Bandai Namco could better control the narrative and ensure that players experience the game as intended, which makes everyone happy but also maximizes its sales potential. In addition, I do think FromSoft storytelling would have been less effective and impactful if the game was unfinished. However, in defense of the original quote from Thomas Mailer, I wouldn't be opposed to FromSoft trying out some kind of early access model where the players could provide input before the full release, but that's mainly because they already have my trust, and I think they would have the ability to pull off something great that way because they're so good. This could especially work well for the multiplayer focus of their titles. That's one area that arguably hasn't seen as drastic an improvement or as much experimentation over the years, and perhaps letting the community guide that area of development a bit more with their feedback could lead to something great. But overall, I don't expect an early access game from the Dark Souls developers, and the formula for their traditional releases clearly works quite well. And that's where I'll end. I've been working on this one for months on and off, so I hope you enjoyed it. And of course, let me know your thoughts, because I haven't seen this topic discussed before, so I'm curious to see what people think.